The alpha king rejected me the day his wolf chose another. Now it comes to my door. Every dawn Wren had known, from the moment she woke up that morning, that something about the day felt wrong. Not bad wrong. Just wrong. Like a shoe on the wrong foot. Small enough that you can still walk, but you feel it with every step. She was 22 years old, and she had lived her whole life in the shadow of other people's opinions of her. Her mother had died when she was 6. Her father had died 2 years after that, in a border skirmish nobody talked about anymore, because talking about it made people uncomfortable. She had been raised by her aunt, a stern woman named Ottilie, who loved her in the way that some people love, by feeding her, clothing her, and never once telling her she was pretty, because Ottilie believed that pretty words made girls soft, and soft girls got hurt. So Wren grew up practical instead of soft. She sewed. She mended nets for the fishing families down by the river. She had a way with animals that unsettled some of the older pack members, because animals liked her more than people did, and in a town full of wolves, that was saying something. The town was called Ashen Hollow, and it sat at the base of a mountain range, so old that nobody remembered what the mountains had been called before the wolves came. The pack that ruled it was the Vale Pack, and the Vale Pack had ruled it for 11 generations, and the current king of that pack was a man named Ronan Vale, who at 26 had already buried a father, a mother, and one older brother, and who wore his crown the way some men wear a coat they didn't choose but can't take off in public. Every unmarried wolf in the kingdom knew about the choosing ceremony. It was old law, older than the crown itself. When a king or queen came of age to marry, they did not choose their own partner. Their wolf did. The animal half of them, the part that could not lie or calculate or worry about political alliances, was let loose in a hall full of candidates, and whoever the wolf turned to, whoever it touched first, that person became the future queen or king. It was supposed to be unshakable. It was supposed to be the truest thing in the world, because a wolf's heart, unlike a human's, could not be talked into anything. Wren had been invited to stand in that hall, not because anyone expected her to be chosen, but because every unmarried woman in Ashen Hollow, above the age of 18, was required to stand there, out of respect for tradition. She had stood in the very back, behind girls in dresses that cost more than her aunt made in a year, and she had told herself, the whole walk there, not to hope for anything. She had hoped anyway, just a little, just enough to make the rejection sting more than it should have. The Hall of First Light was the oldest building in Ashen Hollow, built from pale stone that seemed to hold the morning sun inside it even at night. Torches burned along both walls. 300 wolves packed into a space meant for 200, all of them dressed in their best, all of them murmuring the particular kind of gossip that happens only in rooms where everyone is pretending not to gossip. King Ronan Vale stood at the front of the hall in a black coat that had been tailored so precisely it looked like a second skin. He did not smile. He rarely did. People said the last time anyone had seen him smile properly was before his brother died, and that had been 4 years ago. When the ceremony began, the change happened the way it always happened, a shudder running through him like a held breath finally released, fur sheeting over skin, bones rearranging themselves with a sound like knuckles cracking underwater, and then there was no king standing at the front of the hall. There was a wolf, silver-furred, broad-shouldered, eyes the pale gold of a coin polished by too many hands. The wolf turned its head. 300 people held their breath at once. It walked past the first row of candidates. It walked past the second. Wren, standing near the back with her hands folded in front of her the way her aunt had taught her, watched it come closer and closer, and some small, foolish part of her chest lifted, just slightly, the way a kite lifts before the wind decides whether or not to carry it. The wolf stopped in front of Sable Ashworth. Sable was the daughter of the Eastern Pack's Alpha, and she was beautiful in the specific, engineered way that comes from a lifetime of the best food, the best tutors, and the best doctors. She had a laugh that carried across rooms and teeth so straight they looked painted on. She did not look surprised when the wolf's head came to rest against her open palm. She looked like a woman collecting something she had already been told was hers. The kite in Wren's chest did not fall gently. It dropped like something cut. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago not to cry where people could see her, because crying in public was, in Ashen Hollow, its own kind of gossip fuel, and Wren had had enough of being talked about for one lifetime. Instead, she looked down at her own hands. There was a hangnail on her left thumb, small and white and ragged at the edge, and she fixed all of her attention on it the way a swimmer fixes on the surface of the water when they don't want to think about how deep it goes below them. She picked at the hangnail until it tore and a small bead of blood came up. When the king returned to his human shape, dressed again, composed again, he said the old words in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "My wolf has chosen, and I honor its choosing." He did not look at Wren when he said it. He did not look at anyone in particular. His eyes, for 1/2 of 1 second, seemed to catch on something, a flicker, quick as a match being struck and blown out before it could take. But Wren told herself later that she had probably imagined it, because a girl standing in the back of a hall, freshly rejected, will imagine almost anything to make the rejection hurt less. She left before the ceremony had fully ended. Nobody stopped her. Nobody really noticed, except for the handful of people whose particular hobby was noticing things like that, filing them away for later, for conversations over dinner about the girl who had clearly hoped for something she had no business hoping for. The walk home was long enough for the cold evening air to dry the sweat on the back of her neck, and short enough that she didn't have time to compose herself before Ottilie opened the door and took one look at her face and knew everything without being told. "Not you, then," Ottilie said. It wasn't cruel. It was just Ottilie's way, plain and unpadded, the same way she'd tell you it was raining, or that supper was cold. "No," Wren said. "Not me." "Good," said Ottilie, which was such a strange thing to say that Wren actually looked up. "Kings are trouble. You'd have spent the rest of your life being looked at." Wren didn't have the energy to explain that she had spent her whole life being looked at anyway, just not in the way that mattered. She went inside. She sat by the fire. She didn't cry until the door was shut and bolted, and even then it didn't come out as crying exactly, more like one long breath that shook on its way out of her. The kind of breath that happens when something structural gives way, quietly, one beam at a time, without any of the noise you'd expect from something falling down. She slept. She didn't remember deciding to. The wolf came at dawn. She almost didn't open the door. Some tired, hollowed-out part of her wanted to stay in bed until the whole world forgot she existed, at least for one more hour. But there was a habit in her, built over years of living in a small house with thin walls, of checking on sounds outside, and the sound outside her door that morning was not a normal sound. It was a low, patient breathing, steady as a heartbeat, coming from something too big to be a cat and too quiet to be a person. She opened the door on reflex before her brain caught up to what her body already understood. The wolf sat on her step, silver fur, gold eyes, easily the size of the doorframe it filled. It did not growl. It did not move toward her. It sat with its tail curled around its front paws like a house pet waiting to be let in, watching her with an expression that, on a human face, she would have called sorry. "You picked her," Wren said, because it was the only sentence in her whole body that morning, and it came out before she could stop it. The wolf tilted its head, slow, like the sentence had landed somewhere unfamiliar. Wren shut the door. She told herself it was a mistake, some accident of scent or memory, the animal wandering off from wherever it was supposed to be. Wolves were not so different from dogs in some ways. They had habits, routes, places their noses remembered from puppyhood. Maybe Wren's house, on the edge of town, backed onto a trail the wolf used to run as a pup, before it grew up to be the most important animal in the kingdom. It came back the next dawn, and the one after that. By the fourth morning, she had stopped being surprised and started being embarrassed, because her neighbor Maddox, an old man with a face like a dried apple and nothing better to do with his mornings than notice other people's business, was leaning over the low fence between their properties with a look of pure, uncomplicated delight. "Word is," Maddox said, chewing on something he probably shouldn't have been eating that early, "the king can't get his wolf to leave your step. Sable's none too pleased about that, from what I hear." "I didn't ask it to come," Wren said. "Didn't say you did." He chewed some more. "Just saying it's not leaving." Wren wanted, badly, to feel something like triumph. She had grown up on the old stories, the ones told around fires in winter, about wolves who chose wrongly under pressure and then spent years trying to correct the mistake, about bonds that could not be faked no matter how hard anyone tried to force them. If those stories were true, then this, the wolf, returning again and again, sitting patient and silver on her doorstep every single morning, should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like being handed a gift she had already told the shop she couldn't afford, because underneath the strange, flattering fact of it, there was a colder, more practical fact. Nothing had actually changed. The ceremony had happened. The words had been said in front of 300 witnesses. Sable Ashworth was, as far as the whole kingdom was concerned, the future queen of Ashen Hollow, and Wren was the girl the wolf hadn't picked, standing at her door every morning wondering why the same wolf that hadn't picked her kept showing up anyway. Anger arrived to fill the space where confusion had been sitting, and Wren let it, because anger was familiar in a way that hope was not. She knew exactly how anger fit her. She had worn it before, after her father died, after every small unfairness of growing up poor and unchosen in a town that valued neither. It slid onto her like an old coat pulled out from the back of a closet, worn soft in all the places that mattered. On the 7th morning, she opened the door before the wolf could even settle onto the step. "You had your chance," she told it, arms crossed, voice steadier than she felt. "In front of everyone. 300 people watched you choose her. You don't get to come here every morning, like I'm a habit you haven't gotten around to breaking yet." The wolf's ears folded back. Not fear exactly. Something closer to a wince, the kind of expression a dog gets when it's been caught doing something it knows it shouldn't. Except this wasn't guilt over chewed shoes. This was something heavier, something that looked almost like grief. For one long second, Wren thought the wolf would finally leave, that her words had done what 300 witnesses in a stone hall hadn't managed, sent it away for good, freed her from the strange daily reminder of the day she'd been passed over. Something in her chest dropped at the thought, fast and unwelcome, a feeling she refused to give a name to. The wolf didn't leave. Instead it stood, crossed the small distance between the step and where she stood in the doorway, and pressed its head against her knee, slow and deliberate, the exact gesture it had made toward Sable's open palm in front of the whole kingdom. Wren didn't move. She didn't reach down to touch it, though some old animal part of her wanted to. She stood very still with the wolf's head warm and heavy against her leg, her thumb still sore where the hangnail had torn days ago, and she let herself imagine, for exactly as long as it took to draw one full breath, that a mistake made in front of 300 witnesses could somehow, quietly, in the coldest hour of the morning when nobody else was awake to see it, be taking itself back. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just didn't close the door. That was how it started, the strange new routine that neither of them spoke about but both of them kept showing up for. Every dawn, before the rest of Ashen Hollow rubbed the sleep from its eyes, the king's wolf walked the long path from the royal grounds to the small house on the edge of town. And every dawn, Wren opened the door and let it sit on her step, sometimes talking to it, sometimes not, always eventually going back inside to get on with her day, while the wolf, after a while, got up and padded back the way it came. She told herself it meant nothing. She told her aunt it meant nothing, when Ottilie finally noticed the pattern and asked, with her usual bluntness, whether Wren was planning on inviting trouble to breakfast every morning for the rest of her life. "It's just an animal," Wren said. "Animals don't always make sense." Said Ottilie, in the tone of a woman who did not believe a word of it, but had decided, for once, not to argue. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed everything, and what it lacked in kindness, it made up for in thoroughness. Within 2 weeks, half of Ashen Hollow had an opinion about the girl on the edge of town and the wolf that wouldn't stay away from her, and the opinions ranged from pity, "Poor thing, can't take a hint, even the wolf feels sorry for her," to suspicion, "She must be doing something to it, some kind of charm. Wolves don't just wander off from their intended mate for no reason." Sable Ashworth heard all of it, because Sable Ashworth made it her business to hear everything that concerned her, and by the 3rd week, The whispers had done what whispers do best. They had gotten back to her in a shape uglier and more exaggerated than the truth. She arrived at Wren's door on a gray afternoon, dressed in riding clothes that cost more than the house Wren lived in, flanked by two of her father's guards who stood a respectful distance back, but close enough to make their presence a kind of threat. "You're the seamstress," Sable said, as though she hadn't already known exactly who Wren was for weeks. "The one his wolf keeps visiting." "I don't control where it goes," Wren said. "No," Sable agreed, in a voice smooth as poured cream. "I don't imagine you do. Animals are so unpredictable. But people talk, and talk is a kind of poison, and I would hate for poison to spread through a kingdom that's about to have a wedding in it." She smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near her eyes. "You understand." "I understand you'd like me to stop answering my own door," Wren said, before she could think better of it. Something flickered across Sable's face. Surprise, maybe, that the seamstress had a spine after all, and then it smoothed over again into pleasant, practiced calm. "I'd like," she said, "for you to remember your place. The wolf made its choice. Whatever confusion is happening now is just an animal being an animal. It will pass. These things always pass." She looked past Wren, into the small dim house behind her, taking in the mended curtains and the modest furniture with an expression that made Wren's face go hot. "I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself waiting for something that was never going to happen." She left without waiting for a response, guards falling into step behind her, and Wren stood in her doorway for a long time afterward, feeling smaller than she had in years, and hating herself a little for feeling that way over words from a woman who had everything already. The wolf came again the next dawn, as it always did, and for the first time, Wren almost didn't open the door. She stood on the other side of it for a long moment, listening to that familiar patient breathing, and thought about Sable's face, and thought about 300 witnesses, and thought about how much easier her life would be if she simply stopped answering. "She opened the door anyway. She came to see me," Wren told the wolf, before she could stop herself, because apparently she had reached the point of talking to an animal like it could understand every word, which was, she was aware, its own kind of foolish. "You're intended. She wants me to stop opening this door." The wolf's ears went flat again, that same wince-like motion, and it made a low sound in its throat that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine, something in between, something that, in a human voice, might have been frustration. "I don't know what you want me to do with that," Wren said. "I'm not the one who chose wrong." The wolf sat down heavily on the step, like the sentence had taken something out of it, and stayed there long after Wren had gone back inside, long enough that Oddly, on her way out to the market, had to step around it with a look of long-suffering exasperation, as though the wolf were an inconvenient piece of furniture someone had left in the yard. It was Maddox, in the end, who gave Wren the piece of information that changed everything, though he did it in his usual roundabout way, more interested in the telling than in getting to the point quickly. "My grandmother used to say," he told her, leaning on the fence one morning, while the wolf sat patiently on Wren's step a few feet away, seemingly unbothered by the conversation happening about it, "that a wolf's choosing can't be undone, can't be faked either. That's the whole point of the ceremony. The animal half of a person can't be talked into liking someone it doesn't like, and it can't be talked out of liking someone it does. Politics can lie, money can lie, a crown can lie all day long, but the wolf underneath, that part's supposed to be honest all the way through." "Then why did it choose her?" Wren asked, gesturing at the animal on her step, who perked its ears at the sound of the question like it, too, wanted to hear the answer. Maddox shrugged, an old man's shrug, slow and considering. "That," he said, "is the part nobody's been able to explain to my satisfaction. Wolves don't second-guess themselves, girl. Not usually. Something happened in that hall, or I'm no judge of animals, and I've been keeping goats and watching wolves in this town for 60 years. It was a small piece of information, easy to dismiss, the kind of thing an old man says while chewing on something he probably shouldn't be eating that early in the day. But it sat in the back of Wren's mind for the rest of that week, growing heavier the longer she carried it, until she found herself, one evening, walking toward the royal grounds with no clear plan, beyond needing to ask the one question nobody else seemed willing to ask out loud. She did not expect to actually see the king. She expected to be turned away at the gate, to leave a message with some guard who would never pass it along, to walk home feeling foolish for even trying. Instead, she found Ronan Vale standing alone near the training yard at the edge of the grounds, in shirt sleeves instead of his usual black coat, looking less like a king and more like a tired young man who had spent the whole day carrying something heavy and hadn't yet found anywhere to put it down. He saw her before she could decide whether to turn back. "You're the one it keeps visiting," he said, not unkindly, almost curious. "You know I am," Wren said. "Half the kingdom knows." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile passed over his face, and was gone before it could properly land. "Half the kingdom knows a great many things that aren't true," he said. "But this one happens to be true, yes." "Why?" Wren asked. Because there was no version of this conversation where she had the patience for careful, polite circling. "Why does it keep coming? I didn't ask it to. I don't want the trouble it's bringing me." Ronan looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not the cold, composed expression he'd worn in the Hall of First Light, but something rawer, more uncertain, like a man looking at a puzzle he'd been given no instructions for. "I don't know," he said finally, and it seemed to cost him something to admit it. "I've asked myself the same question every morning for weeks. My wolf has never done anything like this before. It chose in that hall. It said the words, in its way. It went where it was supposed to go. And then that same night, it started pulling toward your side of town. And it hasn't stopped since, no matter what I do." "Maybe it made a mistake," Wren said, though the words tasted strange in her mouth, half hope and half fear of hope. "Wolves don't make mistakes like that," Ronan said, echoing, almost word for word, what Maddox had told her over the fence. "That's what troubles me. If it had simply changed its mind, I could understand that. Animals are allowed to be fickle, same as anyone. But this feels different. It feels like something is being corrected, not changed, like a wound trying to heal itself in the wrong direction." Wren didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and for a moment they simply stood there, two people who had been given no good options by an ancient piece of law neither of them had asked to be bound by. "I don't have an answer for you," Ronan said eventually. "I wish I did. I'm sorry for whatever trouble this has brought to your door, truly. But I don't know how to make my own wolf behave, and I've never had to learn, because it's never once disagreed with me before now." Wren walked home that evening with more questions than she'd arrived with, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled somewhere underneath her ribs. Not quite hope, because hope felt too dangerous to name outright, but something adjacent to it, something that made the walk feel shorter than it should have. The weeks that followed were strange ones. The wolf kept coming, every dawn, without fail, and Wren stopped fighting it, mostly. She still didn't understand what it meant, if it meant anything at all, but she found herself, almost against her will, looking forward to those quiet mornings before the rest of the world woke up, when it was just her and the animal and the particular kind of silence that comes before sunrise. She started talking to it more, not about anything important at first, the weather, the mending she had to finish that day, the state of Ottilie's temper, but slowly, without quite meaning to, she started telling it things she hadn't told anyone, about her mother, whom she barely remembered except as a smell, lavender and wood smoke, about her father, and the way nobody in town ever talked about how he'd actually died, which somehow made it worse than if they'd just said it plainly, about the particular loneliness of being raised by someone who loved you practically, instead of warmly, and how she'd spent her whole life not quite sure if that counted as being loved at all. The wolf listened. It always listened, ears forward, gold eyes steady on her face, in a way that no person in her life had ever quite managed. There was something about telling secrets to an animal that couldn't repeat them that made the telling easier, safer, like writing in a diary that happened to breathe. Meanwhile, in the royal house, things were less peaceful. Sable Ashworth had noticed, of course, that her intended's wolf continued its strange morning pilgrimage no matter what she said or did about it, and a woman like Sable did not take well to being ignored by something she considered rightfully hers. She went, eventually, to a woman on the edge of the Eastern Territory, a woman the pack elders spoke of in low voices and half-finished sentences, a woman who dealt in things most respectable wolves pretended did not exist, old charms, bent magic, favors that always cost more than they seemed to at the time. Sable did not tell anyone where she was going. She told her guards she was visiting an old family friend, and in a way, that was even true if you stretched the word friend very far indeed. What exactly passed between them in that meeting, nobody in Ashen Hollow would learn until much later, and even then only in pieces, but the result of it became clear within days. The wolf's visits to Wren's door grew shorter, more strained, its movements stiffer, like an animal walking against a wind only it could feel. Some mornings it arrived late, exhausted, as though it had fought its own body the whole way there. Once, it did not come at all, and Wren spent that entire day with a strange hollow feeling she refused to examine too closely, and when it appeared the next morning, there was a thin, raw mark across its shoulder, like it had strained against something invisible and lost. She asked it, of course, what had happened, though she knew it could not answer her in words. It only pressed its head against her hand, harder than usual, like it needed the contact more than it needed to explain itself, and Wren, without deciding to, found herself running her fingers gently along the mark, the way you'd soothe any hurt creature, and something in her chest cracked open a little wider than it had before. She went back to Maddox, because Maddox, despite his gossip and his chewing and his tendency to take the long way around any story, was the only person she trusted to tell her something true without dressing it up first. "Someone's binding it," he said, once she'd described the mark, the exhaustion, the strange stiffness in its movements. He didn't say it lightly. His face had gone serious, in a way she hadn't seen on him before. "That's an old, ugly kind of magic, girl. Binding a wolf's instinct against its own nature. It's not supposed to be possible, not with something as deep as a choosing. But there are always people willing to try what shouldn't be possible if the price is right and the desperation is deep enough." "Who would do that?" Wren asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, had suspected it since the day Sable Ashworth stood in her doorway, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Someone who stands to lose everything if the wolf's true choosing ever comes out into the light," Maddox said. "You want my advice? Go to the king, not the wolf, the king himself. He needs to hear this from someone he trusts, and I don't imagine that's me." Wren did not feel in any way like someone the king trusted. She barely knew him. A handful of conversations, most of them stiff and uncertain on both sides, but she thought of the wolf's raw shoulder, of its exhausted eyes, of the strange stiff way it had walked the last few mornings, like something in it was being pulled two directions at once, and she found that she could not simply do nothing. She went to the royal grounds again that evening, and this time the guard at the gate, recognizing her from her previous visit, let her through without much resistance, which told her something about how visible her strange routine with the king's wolf had already become to the household staff. She found Ronan in the same training yard as before, and this time she didn't wait for him to speak first. "Someone is hurting your wolf," she said, "on purpose. There's a mark on its shoulder, and it's been coming to me later every morning, more tired every time, like it's fighting something the whole way. I think someone doesn't want it near me, and I think they're willing to use magic to stop it." Ronan's face, which had been carefully composed a moment before, went very still. "Show me," he said. The wolf did not come again that evening, since dawn was still hours away, but Ronan listened to every detail she could give him, the timing, the exhaustion, the mark, the strange stiff gait, with the focused attention of a man assembling a puzzle he suddenly suspected had been sabotaged from the start. "I need you to come at dawn," he said finally, "tomorrow. I need to see it myself, when it happens, not hear about it after." Wren agreed, though some small tired part of her wondered what good it would do, whether the truth, once uncovered, would even matter to a kingdom that had already watched the ceremony happen, already heard the old words spoken, already begun preparing for a wedding that half the town assumed was only a matter of time. The next dawn, Ronan was waiting outside her house before the wolf arrived, standing in the cold half-light in his shirt sleeves again, looking like he hadn't slept. They watched together as the wolf came into view down the path, and Wren saw, for the first time through someone else's eyes as well as her own, exactly how wrong its movements were. The hitching stride, the way its head kept turning back toward the royal grounds as though something were tugging it in that direction, even as its feet kept carrying it forward. The raw mark on its shoulder now angrier and more inflamed than the day before. Ronan made a sound low in his throat, something between anger and grief, and crossed the distance to kneel in front of his own wolf, running his hands carefully over the mark, and whatever he found there made his whole face go cold in a way Wren had never seen on him before, colder even than the day of the ceremony. "This isn't natural," he said. "This is old binding work. Someone has been forcing my wolf's instincts against themselves since the night of the choosing." He looked up at Wren, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression, as though he were somehow responsible for not having seen it sooner. "I think," he said slowly, "that the ceremony itself may have been tampered with. I think my wolf never actually chose Sable Ashworth at all." The words landed in the cold morning air between them, and Wren felt something shift inside her chest, something she'd been holding very carefully still for weeks, finally allowed to move. What followed was not simple, and it did not happen quickly, because uncovering old magic and proving it to a kingdom that had already accepted a different story takes more than a single conversation in a training yard at dawn. Ronan brought in the pack's oldest healer, a quiet woman named Bettina, who had served 3 generations of Vale kings, and who took one look at the mark on the wolf's shoulder and confirmed, in a voice gone tight with anger, that it was indeed the mark of an old binding charm, the kind used to force an animal's instinct to point somewhere it did not naturally want to go. "It's a temporary thing," Bettina explained, examining the wolf carefully while it sat, patient and exhausted, in the middle of the training yard. "Powerful, but temporary. It has to be renewed, over and over, or the true instinct beneath it starts pushing back through, the way a plant pushes up through pavement if you don't keep pouring more concrete over it." She looked up at Ronan. "Someone has been renewing this charm for weeks. That takes access to old, expensive, illegal work. It also takes motive." The motive was not hard to guess, though proving it took longer, and involved sending quiet, careful questions out to the edge of the Eastern Territory, to the woman the pack elders spoke of in low voices, who did not give up her secrets easily but who, when faced with the full weight of a king's investigation and the threat of exile from every territory in the kingdom, eventually admitted who had come to her, and when, and what she had asked for. The reveal, when it finally came, happened not in the Hall of First Light this time, but in a smaller council chamber, with only the pack elders, the king, and a handful of witnesses present, Wren among them, standing near the back again, though this time nobody looked at her with pity. Sable Ashworth did not deny it. In the end, once the evidence was laid out plainly enough that denial would have made her look even worse than confession. She stood very straight, chin lifted, and said that she had done what any woman would do to protect what she believed was rightfully hers, that the wolf's original hesitation before choosing her had felt like an insult she refused to accept, that she had simply helped nature along in the direction it was clearly meant to go anyway. Nobody in the room believed that last part, least of all Ronan, whose face had gone from cold to something harder, something with real anger underneath the composure he usually wore like armor. "You bound my wolf against its own nature," he said, "and you let it suffer for weeks rather than release it, because releasing it would have meant admitting you were never truly chosen at all." Sable said nothing to that. There was nothing left to say. She was sent from Ashen Hollow within the week, back to her father's territory in the east, with her family's alliance with the Vale Pack, quietly, permanently ended. It was not a violent ending, and it was not meant to be one. The pack elders were firm that whatever anger the kingdom felt, it would not be answered with cruelty, only with consequence, plain and unavoidable. Sable left with her belongings, her guards, and whatever pride she had left, and Ashen Hollow, for the most part, was glad to see her go. The binding charm broken, the wolf recovered within days, the raw mark on its shoulder healing clean, its strength and its strange stiff gait both returning to normal. And on the first dawn after the charm was fully lifted, it came to Wren's door, not exhausted, not stiff, not fighting some invisible tether pulling it two directions at once, but easy and sure, the way it must have wanted to come all along. There was, eventually, a second ceremony, though this one was quieter than the first, held not in the crowded hall of First Light, but in the training yard, where Ronan and Wren had first really spoken, with only the pack elders and a handful of close witnesses present, because Ronan had said, plainly, that he did not want this one to be a performance for 300 people. He wanted it to simply be true. The wolf did not hesitate, this time. It crossed the yard in the pale early light and pressed its head into Wren's open palm, exactly the way it should have done from the very start, and this time nobody in the small gathered crowd held their breath in surprise, because by then, everyone already knew. Ronan, once he'd returned to his own shape, did not say the old formal words this time either. He simply looked at her, in a way that felt entirely unlike the composed, distant expression he'd worn during the first ceremony, and said, "I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to catch up, to what was real from the start." "You didn't know," Wren said. "No," he agreed, "but you carried the weight of it anyway, every morning, not knowing if it would ever be fixed. That wasn't fair to you, whether or not I was the one who caused it." Wren thought about the hangnail she'd picked at until it bled, the day of the first ceremony, about the long walk home in the cold, about Ottilie's blunt "not you then," and the way she'd said good like it was a mercy, about every dawn since, the patient breathing outside her door, the gold eyes, the small aching hope she'd refused to name for weeks because naming it felt like inviting it to be taken away again. "It caught up eventually," she said. "That's more than a lot of people get." Ashen Hollow adjusted, the way towns do, gossip settling into new shapes around a new story. Maddox, for his part, took no small satisfaction in reminding anyone who'd listen that he'd said all along a wolf's choosing couldn't be faked, that his grandmother had told him so 60 years ago, and she'd never once been wrong about an animal in her life. Ottilie did not soften exactly, because Ottilie did not know how to soften, not really, but she did, on the morning of the small quiet wedding that followed a season later, press a folded handkerchief into Wren's hand and say, gruffly, "Your mother would have liked this." She always did like a story that worked out in the end, even when she pretended not to believe in them. And every dawn after that, for the rest of their long lives together, the wolf still came to greet her first, before the man did, the way it always had, the way it always should have, patient and silver and sure, sitting a moment on whatever step or threshold they happened to share that season, waiting to be let in.